Hello, David Finkelstein from the University of Plymouth. Delighted to be joining you for this symposium series. My topic is on Blackwood's Fin de Siècle Cosmopolitan literary networks. Let's see if I can get on with it. The Irishman, man of letters Stephen Gwynne commented in 1923 that writing for Blackwood's magazine involved participating in a particular literary world and addressing a particular audience. Here's what he had to say about it. Certain publications have an atmosphere of their own, a personality which is not entirely the editor's, nor is it made by the readers, nor by the combined influence of all the customary writers. It results from all of these. And when I write, say, for Blackwood's magazine, I feel myself part of a society. I'm affected by its tone, knowing in a general way what will interest it, what it will like and dislike. It does not get rid of me as the first audience. Nothing by which I cannot interest myself thoroughly is going to interest this circle. But one writes there with a certain pleasure as one goes to a hospitable house. The House of Blackwood, founded in 1805 in Edinburgh by William Blackwood I, by late century had built up eminent cultural capital in the publishing world. It espoused personal connections with its authors that represented a specific social space, as well as an visible arena that accommodated shifting bands of contributors and authors, who were all encouraged to meet, to mingle, to imbibe a common culture, and to share a common unspoken assumption about their identities within this large, all-embracing Blackwoodian identity. And this was exemplified in physical form in their beautiful round room in George Street, Edinburgh, where from the firm's early days authors met to drink and discuss their latest contributions. Most of you already know the history of this firm. Blackwood's enjoyed spectacular success, moving from early days of publishing authors like McGinn and Susan Ferrier right through to under the leadership of John Blackwood between 1845 and 1879, publishing extremely valuable interventions in the British literary world. George Eliot, Edward Bulwer Lytton, Anthony Trollope, Lawrence Oliphant, Margaret Oliphant. Led by John Blackwood, who was outgoing and personable, the key signature aspect of the firm during that time was a cultivation of authors in a way that was meant to be personable and connected. John's nephew, William Blackwood III, assumed control of the firm on John's death in 1879. One of the strengths that he inherited from his uncle was exactly that style of publishing management that had involved fostering those personal relationships with his authors to maintain a community of writers. Though in his case, he was a bit shyer and less expansive than his larger-than-life uncle. In 1896, William recruited the Scots literary mediator David Storrar Meldrum as his London office manager. He was a perspicacious literary editor with strong contacts in the literary world, and Meldrum's open style complemented William's quieter personal approach. Meldrum provided those useful London-based networking support for such community building. What's really important about this, and I'll get to the reality of what it means for cosmopolitan outlooks, was that Meldrum was astute in gauging that the firm needed to recover its position as a leading publisher of the day. And they did this by actively seeking out and developing new talent rather than waiting for individuals to come to the firm. Doing so meant having to engage with a wider circle of authors than previously managed, of becoming more cosmopolitan in outreach and vision. Meldrum played a key role in bringing to Blackwood's works such as Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness and Lord of Jim. Conrad was not the only author that was championed by Meldrum. Others who were encouraged to join the firm's lists included Stephen Crane, Hugh Clifford, John Galsworthy, Henry Lawson, Australian Miles Franklin, John Buchan, and the Scots literary flaneur Neil Munro, with whom Meldrum formed a very strong friendship. Among the effects of publishing difficulties encountered by the firm post-1880 was a decided venturing into novels and literary production that catered for more popular markets. So in this case, trying to move into areas related to Scottish fiction and new women writers in particular. So in addition to cultivating Scottish authors such as Neil Munro and John Buchan, Meldrum and Blackwood's quietly cultivated equally valuable circles of London and regionally based women popular novelists, many of whom were graduates of the University of London, and they would go on to form the core of the firm's literary production throughout the 1890s and 1900s. Now here's a question: who were these women the firm became to feature in their lists. And what other ways were they linked aside from sharing a publishing imprint? One of the important avenues in social spaces that's not often been documented in past scholarship, although Linda K. Hughes has pointed to it in recent work, were the social connections that were fostered through women's literary clubs that began springing up in the 1880s and 1890s as a response to the men's-only social spaces that were dominating the cultural scene at the time. In this case, Clubland. Literary and dining clubs, of course, had been in existence dating back to the early 18th century, and many of which had emerged from the more than 2,000 coffee houses that had served as social and cultural spaces in the early 1700s throughout the United Kingdom. The club system was geared to supporting men's and male social interactions, and many of you who work in Scottish literature fiction will know, of course, that Burns and Walter Scott had belonged to several during their heyday, and that's been very heavily charted and dealt with in a great deal of work that has looked at Scottish literary clubs that flourished, particularly during the Enlightenment period. By the 19th century, gentlemen's clubs, as they were termed, had developed into niche status, with particularly well-known establishments catering to specific professions and cultural interests. So in Edinburgh, there was the New Club, which originally founded in 1787, had relocated to a rather grand space on Princes Street in 1837. Glasgow hosted such establishments as the Western Club, founded in 1825, the Junior Club, set up in 1868, and the New Club, founded in 1869, obviously a accompaniment to the New Club in Edinburgh. In London, of course, there were more than 400 clubs that existed by the turn of the century, and of note were several such as the Carlton Club, a political club with a conservative membership, or the Athenaeum, which focused on arts and sciences and was located in stately quarters in the Pall Mall, and the Garrick, which hosted actors and lawyers. Women were not permitted generally to be members, and only fitfully permitted into these spaces through carefully monitored means, allowed to attend occasional lectures, occasional meeting, maybe the annual dinner, but they were not allowed to debate or use the men's bar. In response, particularly in London, social activists began establishing women-focused social spaces. So in Glasgow, up sprang the Kelvin Ladies Club, founded in 1897. London saw the launch of such venues as the Pioneer Club, founded in 1892, Sesame Club, founded in 1895, and the Literary Ladies Club, later the Women Writers Dinner Club, which was a dining space founded by a group of new women feminists that included the writer Mona Caird, Honor Morton, Alice Meynell, Graham R. Thompson, and the Irish poet Catherine Tynan. Membership of such clubs allowed women a degree of association with other like-minded women and men that intertwine social interests with networking possibilities. And at times, it also became spaces of encounter for authors linked to the Blackwoodian community. Here, Blackwoodian networks flourished in cosmopolitan fashion. So, for example, in 1905, Violet Martin, who with her cousin Edith Somerville formed the Irish literary team of Somerville and Ross, probably now remembered best as authors of the best-selling The Real Charlotte and the comic masterpiece Some Experiences of an Irish R.M., made the journey from Ireland to London to attend a reading at the New Century Club of two of their stories. In a letter to Edith, Violet recorded meeting two of Blackwood's star authors, mediated by the fellow Irish writer Erminda Rentoul Esler. She writes, "I was there before 4, and I met a luncheon to the Imperial Colonial Press visitors just emerging. I was introduced by Mrs. Rentoul Esler to 1 or 2 Australians, all deuced civil. Then upstairs I met 2 or 3 more of the authors, among them Beatrice Hardin. Dr. Margaret Todd was to have been the boss of the show, but her sister was ill, so Miss Mitten took it on." These chance encounters with Blackwoodian authors Hardin and Todd were some of the many network links that Ross and Somerville accessed to advance their professional reputation. And this is where I think a really important point is about the literary networks and how they fit into the way in which authors become cosmopolitan in their outlook. Indeed, their entry into Blackwood's circle had been facilitated through intervention by 2 other literary contacts. The essayist Andrew Lang, subject of Linda Hughes's plenary talk in an earlier session in the series, and the Irish critic, politician, and Blackwood's magazine contributor Stephen Gwynne. In 1895, Gwyn provided an introduction for Violet Martin that she presented to Blackwood's on a visit to Edinburgh, accompanied by Andrew Lang. Her goal was to negotiate publication of the pair's follow-up to The Real Charlotte, their account of travels through Wales. In this case, it was called Beggars on Horseback, a tour in North Wales. Blackwood's was taken with Violet and her work, and it was issued by Blackwood's in June 1895, as were short stories and Irish tales in Blackwood's magazine in subsequent years. Somerville and Ross thus joined the growing number of women who were promoted in the firm's list over the next 2 decades. Margaret Todd, whom Violet Martin encountered in her sojourn to London in 1905, played an equally significant role in the fortunes of the firm. Doctor and novelist, Scottish-born daughter of a businessman with Indian connections, she had had a peripatetic education in medical schools in Edinburgh, Berlin, Brussels, and London before moving to Edinburgh to preside at the Edinburgh Hospital for Women and Children, which had been founded by her subsequent lifelong partner, Sophia Jex-Blake. Todd supplemented her income and extended her literary interests through writing popular works that chimed with reading interests. Her debut novel, Mona Maclean, published by Blackwood's under the pseudonym Graham Travers in 1892, and subsequently in various cheap editions throughout to 1906, was autobiographical in nature, outlining the story of a committed Scottish woman battling social prejudices to become a doctor. It concludes with matrimonial bliss, of course, and co-partnership with a medical husband in a forward-thinking medical practice. A subtle twist was that Todd achieved such co-partnership in real life with Sophia Jex-Blake from the late 1880s through until Sophia's death in 1912. And Jex-Blake featured in the novel as the earnest, reforming medical student Miss Lascelles, a tiny figure scarcely bigger than a child, yet full of character and dignity. Jex-Blake's literary connections were noted by another Blackwoodian author, in this case the already mentioned Beatrice Hardin, who in a letter to William Blackwood III in early 1894 wrote, "I met Graham Travers' friend the other day, the friend who figures in Mona Maclean as Miss Lascelles." Again, an example of that invisible literary network that we see operating within publishing circles. Hardin frequented the same London clubs as another Blackwood star, the Irish novelist Catherine Cecil Thurston, whose debut novels The Circle and John Chilcot, MP, would become a best-selling sensation for Blackwoods on their release in 1903 and 1904, respectively. Hardin and Thurston shared in common club memberships at the Sesame Club, which was open to both men and women, was concerned with educational matters, and was described as distinctly liberal with perhaps a touch of radicalism. Hardin and Thurston also belonged to the New Vagabonds Club, the New Century Club, and the Women's Writers' Dinner Club, often meeting at these events and functions. It's also often being used for functions where they spoke and often presided over the literary activities that were happening in those events. Thurston's entry into the Blackwood Circle was an interesting insertion of new women literary politics into its lists. And while Blackwood sought to draw Thurston into an intimate cosmopolitan publishing circle with him as paternalistic figure, she in turn drew him into alternative literary circles, inviting him to social events when in London, in which he made connections with individuals outside his usual social space. And such was the case in 1904 when Blackwood's and his sister attended a dinner party hosted by Thurston, where he met T.P. O'Connor, the Irish MP, editor, new journalist, and founder of various radical newspapers and journals. William recorded the event in a thank you letter to Thurston, noting, "My sister and I enjoyed your lunch party, and meeting the great T.P. O'Connor was delightful. I had no idea he could be so pleasant and entertaining. I have to thank him for a most friendly and gratifying article on the 100th anniversary of my firm." What is clear is that Blackwood, in the face of new markets and the rise of more entrepreneurial publishing and periodical competitors, began to turn increasingly to popular authors such as Thurston, Hardin, Todd for economic success. Like other firms of the period, a cosmopolitan approach to literary networks through social interactions expanded the firm's horizons in ways unanticipated. Survival was dependent on incorporating new ideas and milieus into old models. Cosmopolitan outlooks to literary opportunities were needed as part of a standard publishing strategy. I would suggest that publishers like William Blackwood's can be seen as participants in Fin de Siècle literary cosmopolitanism in ways that emphasize personal linkages and social networking. They facilitated literary networks. They offered links and introductions between contemporary literary players. These authors, in turn, circulated through established cosmopolitan social spaces, such as the dining clubs mentioned, furthering the connections initially fostered by the middlemen publishers. As examples such as these show, even conservative bastions of the Scottish publishing world, such as Blackwood's, could be cosmopolitan when needed. Thank you for listening.